Today we're looking at 9 NBA teams who actually cheated to get a superstar player on their team. Blatant cheating doesn't happen often within the NBA, but all 9 of these have physical proof that you can look back on and see for yourself. So let's start things off hot with Larry Bird. And it may surprise you to find out the only reason he ever ended up in Boston was because they cheated to get him. Now maybe at the time it wasn't cheating, but they definitely found a loophole in the system, and a rule was made afterwards to prevent it from ever happening again. And it went like this. Leading up to the time Larry was drafted, the Celtics were a pretty bad team, which landed them with the 6th overall pick in the 1978 NBA draft. And at the time, Larry was a superstar in college basketball, being one of the most watched and talked about young players, with his NCAA championship game against Magic Johnson becoming the most viewed college basketball game of all time. So the Celtics obviously drafted him 6th, but that was only 3 years into his college career. Bird hadn't declared for the draft and had planned on playing all 4 years of college, so they drafted him even though he was never officially supposed to be drafted. He wasn't even ready to go in the league yet. So that allowed them to pretty much secure the guy that was going to be a top 2 pick in the 1979 draft 1 year earlier with only the 6th pick. And it worked. I mean, the Celtics drafted him in 78, he finished his final year of school and didn't play in the league until 1979, which caused the NBA to create the Bird Collegiate rule, which basically says they must first declare for the NBA draft before actually being selected into the league. Now we mentioned Magic Johnson earlier, and it was another old rule that actually allowed him to end up on the Los Angeles Lakers. And I mentioned this briefly in a recent video, but I have to run by it again. And to do that, we have to look at former Lakers star Gail Goodrich. You see, Gail put together a Hall of Fame career mainly due to his time in LA. He was a multiple-time All-Star and even played a major role in their 1972 NBA championship. Well, by the 76 season, he was ready to move on to a new team. So he signed a contract with the New Orleans Jazz, but it wasn't that simple. Because back in the 70s, if your team was losing a star player in free agency, the new team had to give some compensation to make up for it. So New Orleans gave LA 2 first-round picks, which was nothing too crazy, but when Goodrich tears his Achilles in his first season on his new team, they become one of the worst in the NBA. And one of those first round picks just so happened to turn into the 1979 first overall draft pick because of the situation, which then landed the Lakers Magic Johnson, and the rest is history. This was actually by no means cheating, and it was just a part of the rules back in the day. But to see how the rules are today, and the fact that teams had to give up compensation for signing someone else's free agent back then, just seems straight up unfair when you compare it to today's rules. When you think about how things are now, it seems like the New Orleans Jazz just got straight up scammed with this whole situation. And there was actually another instance like this that was pretty similar and happened right around the same time. And this scenario took place in 1974 between the Golden State Warriors and again the LA Lakers. But Los Angeles actually lost on this one because a guy named Cazzie Russell was going from the Warriors to the Lakers in free agency. He was a decent player, but obviously none of us have ever heard of him. And to make things fair, LA sent Golden State a first round pick. Well, 2 years later, that first round pick turned into Robert Parrish, who was drafted 8th overall. Of course, Parrish would go on to become a Hall of Famer and multiple-time champion for the Boston Celtics, who weren't the actual team that drafted him, but it's just a little known fact that a player as good as Robert Parrish was actually stolen away from a team as prestigious as the LA Lakers. But now let's look at things a little more recently for another prestigious NBA team in the New York Knicks, and how they stole Jalen Brunson from the Mavs using some real sneaky tactics. You see, it all started on April 16th of 2022, when Julius Randle and Knicks front office members showed up courtside to watch Game 1 of the Jazz and Mavs series, while the Knicks had already been heavily involved in rumors of wanting to acquire either Donovan Mitchell or Jalen Brunson. This was the first questionable move by the Knicks, and I'm kinda surprised it's even allowed for other teams' front office members to physically show up and scout other teams' players right in the open like that. Plus, it also sends a message to both players that the Knicks were clearly interested, before they were even allowed to start negotiating with either of them. Now, the second moment of straight up publicly cheating to get Jalen Brunson happened on June 1st, just 5 days after the Mavs were eliminated from the playoffs, when the Knicks announced the signing of Jalen Brunson's dad, Rick Brunson, to be an assistant coach. The man hadn't been an assistant in the NBA for over 5 years, and just randomly he's the guy the Knicks decided to sign to their team. It wasn't a coincidence, and Mark Cuban said that he knew right away once this happened, they had already lost Jalen. He said they didn't even get a chance to negotiate with Brunson before it was made clear that he was signing with New York, which did cause the league to punish their team by taking away their 2025 second round pick. Like, come on. They stole a future all-star and franchise player by talking to him before free agency opened up, and all it cost them was a second round pick. At the end of the day, Jalen Brunson was always headed to the Knicks though, thanks to his father signing and the fact that his actual godfather is the current Knicks president, and seeing how he also grew up in New York. But either way, this team still technically cheated to get the signing done. And while you can feel bad for Luka and the Dallas Mavericks, they aren't so innocent themselves if we look back at this past season. After their up and down year, they ended the season out playing terribly, and their season really came down to the very last game against the Chicago Bulls. If they won the game, they would have made the play-in tournament, but at the same time, it would have meant their 10th overall pick in the upcoming draft would have gone to the New York Knicks thanks to the old Kristaps Porzingis trade. So instead of going for the playoffs, Dallas knew they weren't ready anyways, so they sat their entire starting lineup in order to save their 10th pick, which they used to draft Derek Lively II. And thanks to this tactic, it means they pretty much stole him from the Knicks. And the league knew this, which is why they fined Mark Cuban $750,000. In the grand scheme of things though, $750K isn't going to mean a ton for Mark, and he would have much rather had the draft pick instead. I mean, he even matched that amount and donated $1.5 million to charity. We've seen tanking before, we see it almost every season in the NBA, but we rarely see it this blatantly, especially when it's a team choosing to not make the playoffs. I don't blame the Mavs though. I don't think they could have taken losing any more players to the New York Knicks. Now when the Lakers and LeBron James tampered and eventually got Anthony Davis, it wasn't necessarily cheating, but there were more questionable tactics used to make sure everyone knew that LA was the only place AD was going to end up. And it had started mostly in the 2018 season when it had become pretty common knowledge thanks to rumors that Anthony Davis was going to be traded soon. And with the Lakers having guys like Lonzo Ball, Brandon Ingram, Kyle Kuzma, and KCP, they had the best trade offers by far to get a deal done. Well, fast forward a couple of months into that season when LeBron said publicly that it would be amazing to play with Anthony Davis one day. Around the league, this was felt like tampering by letting it be known that he wanted to play with AD before he ever made a trade request. And it also didn't help that both of these guys shared an agent in Rich Paul. It made for a messy situation that got even worse in February when the Pelicans started fighting back. Because it was now halfway through the season, the Lakers were playing bad on the 10th seed, and the Pelicans intentionally kept leaking info that all the Lakers young players were being offered for Davis and that they were gonna be traded soon. They did this to mess up their locker room, make all their young guys stop playing hard, and throw off the rest of their season, which they did. And that was combined with not trading Davis to LA until the end of the season just so they couldn't have any hope of turning their year around. And that, with the fact that they still got a great return from the Lakers, made for a good move. So shout out to New Orleans for standing up to LeBron and a big market team like LA. Another team in LA was accused of cheating right around the same time, and that was the Clippers and how they went about signing Kawhi Leonard. Because a lot of things during that time were pretty questionable. You see, when Kawhi helped Toronto to a championship, then became a free agent that offseason, a lot of teams were after him, and he was after a lot in return. Reports were coming out that Kawhi Leonard's uncle was demanding that Kawhi get part ownership of the team, a private plane, a house, off-court endorsement money from whichever team he decided to go, and that the Clippers were his preferred destination. Of course, all of these are easily against the NBA's rules, and a player can't really be supplied with anything except a new contract. And Kawhi's uncle was told that none of these were allowed. But his last request to the Clippers was that they bring in another superstar, which actually did end up happening. I just find it insane that all of these requests were actually made. But it's also pretty crazy that 1 year later, a man named Johnny Wilkes, who was apparently close to both Kawhi and his uncle, sued the NBA and the Clippers because they didn't pay him $2.5 million that they promised to, since he gave them crucial information to help Kawhi Leonard get signed there. The league investigated this and nothing ever came out of it, but it's just interesting that Kawhi would ask for all this extra stuff, then a story like that comes out. And it makes you wonder if there was ever even just a little bit of corruptness going on when he signed onto this new team. The Boston Celtics also very publicly cheated to bring in Kyrie Irving a few years back, and I'm still surprised they got away with this with no repercussions. When Kyrie demanded a trade, it was kind of shocking for the Celtics to trade away Isaiah Thomas, who just had a historic postseason run like it was nothing. But the reason they jumped on the opportunity was because they were trading an injured player and they knew it, but nobody else did. They got away with getting Kyrie Irving in exchange for a player who had a career-ending injury that they never told anyone about. Plus the fact that they misdiagnosed IT so he would continue to play in that postseason run, only for his injury to get worse, was just a real scummy thing of them to do. It's wild how much certain teams can get away with. But not everyone gets away with everything. Just to ask the Minnesota Timberwolves and Joe Smith. Because Joe was that guy that got caught taking bad contracts to help his team's money situation. You see, Joe Smith was the 1995 first overall pick, and he played for the Golden State Warriors for 3 seasons. But when it was time for him to sign his first major contract for $80 million, he turned it down and signed a minimum deal with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Yeah, makes no sense. He then signed another minimum deal the next season before the NBA knew something was up and decided to look into this. And they found out that Joe Smith and the Wolves had an agreement that he would sign 3 one-year minimum deals in order to help the team have enough money to play for a championship, with Kevin Garnett leading the charge. And in exchange, in the 4th year, the team was going to sign him to an $86 million deal. But that never happened, because when the league found out, they terminated his contract, stripped the Wolves of their next 5 first-round picks, and Joe Smith only ever ended up making $61 million in his whole career. None of this makes sense, and he would have just been better off taking taking the Warriors' original $80 million contract. But bad things happen when you cheat. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next video.